All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Daf Yomi Vacation Edition. And we are remote again. If you need your link to be able to join us in the future, scroll up on the WhatsApp page until you find where the link is. Probably a good strategy for us is to repost it every week or so that it doesn't get all the way scrolled up at the top.
You
So that
want to hear
way,
something? You want to hear something really cool? In
yeah.
WhatsApp, you can pin a message. So there's no scrolling required. And so the one that contains the link has been pinned.
Wow.
So it's
Okay.
right there.
This is very advanced for me. I appreciate
Pretty
it.
neat.
Okay. So, all right, we are, as we were talking about Morius. Morius, we are about 8 lines down. We had just mentioned, we brought 2 lines, went 2 lines in after the two dots. And we had mentioned that Morius of a professional is acceptable for Jews to use. There's nothing really we're worried about. Morius was made of a fish that had fins and scales, and there were pieces of fins and scales in this Morius that was chopped up. So you couldn't mistake it, right? The only
Is
issue is that they potentially could use wine as a filler. And if you added the wine to it, so then it would make it prohibited to get any to be able to be eaten. Brian's got a question already on the
sorry,
intro.
Lamed Gimel. Sorry,
Oh, I
Lamed
didn't even mention
Gimel.
the
Lamed
page.
Aleph.
I always
Yeah.
mention I count like the lines. I didn't mention the page. Do this every time. Lamed Dalet Amud Beis. Thank you. We're on
Yeah.
Lamed Dalet Amud Beis.
Yeah.
All
We're
right.
good.
That's it.
Thank you. Well spotted. So Morius is going to be permissible. Now, why is it not going to be prohibited to get any hannah from? That's going to be a question we'll hopefully address either depending on how far we get today. It might be the end of today or it might be tomorrow, but you can't eat it because it's got potentially it has wine from Yayin Nesach that's in it. But if it's a professional, no well respected professional Morius dealer is going
Hmm.
to mess with it because he doesn't want the quality of his product questioned. People want to know that they've gotten they've gotten the real professionally made high quality Morius. So you don't have to worry about that. That's what we said. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Gamliel said in the name of Rabbi Hanina ben Gamliel that chilik also is not going to be a problem, despite the fact that chilik is fish that is young, and even though it's kosher, it hasn't grown its fins and scales yet. I guess that as it got older, this chilik fish grew its fins and scales. So the professionals would not allow you to. You could easily, if you were non-professional, slip in a non-kosher fish into it because you wouldn't know the difference. None of them have fins and scales. But a professional wouldn't do that. First of all, professional is very good at selecting out and getting rid of all the fish that were not the proper fish, and it would affect the taste. They wouldn't like the taste of it with the non-kosher fish. So therefore, that was not something that people want. Um, so if it's from a professional, so then you could rely on it. That was the introduction. That was the 2 lines we had said. And now we're up to Tani Avimi Braid Rabbi Yavo. Rabbi Avimi, the son of Ravo, taught as follows: Morius Uman Mutter. So he said, as we had said, that the Morius of an expert Morius dealer, professional. So that's permitted for use, right? No hechsher required on Morius. So who Tani law? The who Amar law. So he said that, but then he taught that brisa. But then he qualified that statement, and he said Pam Rishon Visheni Mutter. He says the first fats that come from the first choppings, I guess, of this Morius fish, that is fine, and the second time as well. Then the unadulterated product is finest quality, and then he could sell it as first cut Morius and second cut Morius. But Shlishi Usser, but the third cut Morius, then already you can't trust. Why? My taima. Pamrishon visheni denofish shumnaihu lo tzarich lemir mibuhu chamra. Since the fish is fatty, the first cut and the second cut is sufficiently oily enough to be able to make a good Morius product, so you don't have to worry about it. Mikan ve'elech ramu bechamra. But afterwards, even the professional might add filler to it because the product itself is not sufficiently moist, I guess, in order to be able to sell it. So even the professionals, it's presumed the professionals will add wine to it. And once you're adding wine to it, then you can't trust it. Yeah, Yehuda.
Does this fish have some sort of forbidden fat that you cannot use? Is that what the
This is
third
not
cut
going to be
is?
chaylev. It's not going to be chaylev, and it's not going to be any kind of fat that the fat that you're not allowed to have on kosher animals is not going to be related to anything that you're going to find on a fish, right? The fish, there's not, very little you can't have on a fish, right? Fish, if it's kosher fish, you can eat it, right? We
What is
don't
the third
have.
cut?
Sorry.
The third cut. Why can't you eat that one?
So
What's wrong
because
with the third
the
cut?
third cut, the problem with the third cut is that they would add wine to make the flavor taste better, right? In order to provide filler to it. So it's not the fish that's the problem, it's the additives, right? What other ingredients are they putting into the third cut? So that's the Morius deal. Okay, Hahu Arba de Moraisa de Asi Linamila de Akko. And we always like stories. There was a ship and it was carrying Morius and it came from Nemila to Akko, and it arrived at the port. Osif Rabbi Abba de Min Akko Nituri Bahada. So Rabbi Abba, who was from Akko, he put a guard on the Morius to make sure that nobody, he put a mashgiach on to make sure that nobody would put any wine into the Morius and to make sure that it was kosher. Amar le Rava. So Rava saw that he did this and he said, great. So the ship pulls into town, and now at the port, you put a mashgiach on it. Ad ha'idna man natra. Before it came to port, who was guarding it then? Right? There was sailors on the ship. You don't know what they did to the Morius before it got here. What good is it to put a security guard on the Morius now that it pulls into port? It had took a long time to get here. You don't know what happened before that. So Amarle, so he said back to him, Ad ha'idna nechush la. So he says, what do you think I have to worry about up until this point? There's nothing for it couldn't possibly be non-kosher up until fine. Now that it's in our port, okay, then it makes sense that people are going to put some wine in it in order to provide some filler. But before that, it wouldn't make any sense because imishum demarvi bechamra. If you're worried that perhaps the sellers, the people on the ship, might put wine in it, kista demorius beluma, kista dechamra bedalume, that the value, the cost of wine, where they were coming from, which we said was Nemila, wine was way more expensive than Morius. The whole reason why this made sense, why we were worried about Morius using wine as a filler, is that wine was the less expensive product. And in order to use it as a filler for your Morius, that's realistic. But why would anybody use wine, which is more expensive, as a filler for something less expensive? That makes no sense. Now, once they arrived in Akko, so then at that point, wine is less expensive, so you have to worry about it. But before it arrived, we wouldn't have to worry about it. So Amar le Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zera. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Zera, Dilma Aidi Ditzur Asu Deshave Chamra. So he says, well, maybe, right? Maybe the issue is since they came from a place called Tsur, right, which had cheaper wine in that area, and they had to, Nemila, in order to get from Nemila to Akko, there was other cities along the way that they could have stopped by port. Maybe they stopped in one of these other cities like Tsur and picked up some wine there, and then they spiked their Morius, and maybe that made it non-kosher. So he says, Amar Le, he says, Hosam ikule upshuri ika. He says there's snow and there's ice, and it's a dangerous area. So the ship would not have attempted to dock in that area of Tsur. They would have avoided that area all the way. So therefore, from Nemila to Akko, they would not have stopped at the port along the way. Nemila has expensive wine. It's only once the ship got to Akko that the concern arose, and that's why he puts the mashgiach on at that point. Okay, good. Next, Ugvinas base Onaiki. We had to worry about the cheese from this place called Onaiki because there were lots of non-Jews that were there. That's what Remeir says. And he says it's not only prohibited, but there's an Isser Hana. There's a prohibition for getting benefit out of it, which implies that we've got some kind of prohibition here where there's Avodah Zara implied here. And the Chachamim said no. It's only prohibited to eat, but it's not prohibited to get any benefit from it. So The Gemara is going to start with Rabbi Meir. Let's talk about Rabbi Meir first. Amar Shimon Lakish. What was the reason why they made a prohibition? What's the reason why you couldn't eat this cheese that was from this place? The answer is because most of the calves that were in that city that were slaughtered for sacrifices of idolatry, right? And the calf, right, that we needed the insides of the calf. We needed the milk that was being congealed inside the stomachs of the calves in order to get the cheese curdling, right? They would mix the process for making the cheese was to get that milk out of the stomach of the calves, mix that together with milk, and then the milk would curdle and separate it curds and whey, right? And you'd gather up the curds and make the cheese out of it. So therefore, you needed that milk from the small calves. Well, if most of the calves are coming from idolatrous animals, so then you're probably getting material from the inside of the stomach of an animal that was slaughtered for idolatry. So Ma'ir Yerova Golim Afilu Miut Nami. Well, why do we have to care that most of the calves in that city are being used for idolatry? Because at the end of the day, remember who we're talking about. We mentioned this before about Rabbi Meir, right? Even if you've got a minority that are being, even if you've got, hang on a second, I just got to make sure my plug for power is back in because I don't want to lose power in the middle. Hang on, Ellie. This is better port. And you know what? Plug that back in, Ellie, behind there. Okay, sorry about that. My plug is going out, but that's okay. I've got plenty of battery power. I just want to be charging while we're going. Okay, good. We're back. I got my charges going. Okay, anyway. So, according to Rabbi Meir, even if you've got a minority, normally we say the majority rules. But if the minority of the calves are for idolatry, there Rabbi Meir says that wouldn't be okay either because Deha Rabbi Meir chayesh l'miuta. Rabbi Meir is the one who says that even if something is a minority, you have to be worried about that minority being prohibited. So therefore, even if you had fewer than the majority of calves being worshipped for idols and slaughtered for idolatry, then you still shouldn't be allowed to use their cheese. So the answer is I ika rov ika miut. So he says either, right? One second. Yeah, so even if they are the majority, they're the minority of all of the animals, even if, sorry, Brian, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna ask, isn't that Basar B'Chalav? I mean, rennet it's even it's like the rice, like from the calf mixing in the milk. You're taking the
Yeah.
stomach of the child.
So we are going to address this, right? I've got hang on a second. Let's back in. So we are going to address the meat milk issue slightly. The Gemara is going to avoid the meat milk issue completely. And nevertheless, even though the Gemara is going to avoid that issue, we're going to see sort of why there are Mefarshim who do question why later on in the Gemara we don't talk about meat milk. The simple explanation at this point is we're talking about the congealed milk that's inside of the animal stomach, not the actual animal stomach.
Okay.
So
Okay,
therefore, we're using congealed milk rather than actual part of the meat of the animal in order to, right? We're not scraping the lining of the stomach in order to mix that with the cheese. We are using the milk we're pouring the contents of the stomach out, which is milk, and using that.
Okay, but we don't usually normally use rennet, do we, in our cheese? Do we use rennet?
We do. I mean, you need something in order to congeal. I believe that in modern cheese, there's a vegetarian option to use. So we avoid using the insides of stomachs. Although I am very sure that there's some traditional cheese made somewhere in like Switzerland in the Alps somewhere or whatever that they make it with the old-fashioned yak stomach or something. I'm sure that there's some yak cheese or something that comes that way. But yeah, Europeans are funny that way. But I don't, but that's not our issue here, right? They're going to use they're using the lining of the inside of the stomach. But, so he says what happens is, so he says, Iamart rov ika miut, el iamart miut, kevan deka rova golim, dein nishchotin lavodos kochavim, vekanami shar mehemos dein nishchotin lavodos kochavim. He says, look, if you're going to say that the majority of the cat, if you're going to take a look like this, you have to have a perspective. Most animals slaughtered in the city were not calves in the first place. And most of the calves, if most of the calves were not slaughtered for idolatry, so what you would have is a small percentage of a small percentage of a minority, what we call a miut de miut, a minority of a minority, less than the majority. If you had a circumstance that less than the majority of the animals slaughtered for idolatry were calves, and then even if it was a calf, less than a majority of the calves were slaughtered for idolatry, then you'd have a minority of a minority. Rabbi Meir is worried about a minority. To be worried about a fraction of a minority, that is a step too far for Rabbi Meir, even for Rabbi Meir. Okay, so that's why Rabbi Meir requires that the majority of the calves be slaughtered for idolatry. Because if the majority of the calves are slaughtered for idolatry, then you're right. Only the minority of animals total are slaughtered for idolatry, but that's a minority. But that's a single minority. That's okay. But if the less than half of if the minority of calves themselves are being slaughtered for idolatry, then you have a minority of calves in a minority of all of the animals. It's a minority of a minority, and even Rabbi Yehuda would say that that's not a problem. So okay. So now, as we said, havale miuta de miuta lo chayesh Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir does not worry about this minority of a minority. Okay. Amar le Rabbi Shimon ben Elyakim, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Shimon ben Bar Elyakim said to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Ki nishchatin la'avodos kochavim mai havi. So he says, okay, I hear what you're suggesting. What you're suggesting is that we're taking the contents of the stomach of an animal slaughtered for idolatry. What difference does that make? At the end of the day, Brian really brought up a good point, which is it's not the animal, right? He made us bring up the point that it's not the animal itself that we're using. If it was the animal itself, maybe you'd have meat and milk problems and all those things. We're not. We're using the contents of the stomach of the animal. The ha'atu deshari. You're the one who said that the contents of the stomach of the animal should be permissible for even if it comes from an animal of idolatry, because it's not the animal itself, it's the contents of the stomach that we're using. That's not the animal itself. De'itmar, here's what we said before. Here's what we said in another place. Hashochet es habehema lizrok dama la'avodos kochavim. This is what Rish Lakish said. If a non-Jew, or I guess it could be a Jew who's doing idolatry, right? He shechts the animal, he slaughters the animal. Now, the slaughtering itself is not making the animal a sacrifice for idolatry. What he intends is, I'm going to slaughter this animal so that I can get the blood. Then I'm going to get the meat and I'm going to get the fats. My intention is, lahaktir chalbo la'avodos kochavim. I'm going to take these fats and I burn the fats to idolatry. The sacrifice to idolatry is the burning of the fats. The slaughtering of the animal is just the way that I kill the animal so that I can get to the fats, which I'm going to use for idolatry. Yeah, Yehuda.
Don't some people have a custom to use blood for a sacrifice in situations like this?
All sacrifices, well, the ones that are animal sacrifices had blood, yes. But remember, this is Avodah Zara, right? So this is their rules could be different. As we'll see that their rules are slightly different. But in any event, this is how he does. He slaughters it, he gets the fat, and he says, I'm slaughtering this so that I can burn the fat. Okay? Now, he never does. Something happens, the animal gets taken away, he never burns this fat. So now, the question is this animal prohibited because it was used for idolatry or not? So Rabbi Yochanan says, Asura. He says the animal's still prohibited. And Kasavar, he holds mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda. He says that the way this works is in the Beis Hamikdash, all of the steps of bringing a sacrifice, which we'll learn about coming up in a few months. We'll start learning about how to bring korbanos, right? You did a shchita, you slaughtered the animal. Then you did a kabbalah, you caught the blood. Then you brought the blood, you did a halacha, you brought the blood close to the mizbeach, and then you did a zrika, you sprinkled the blood on the mizbeach. Those are your 4 steps. Those 4 steps, if I do a action, if I have the wrong intention in one of the malachos, in one of the actions, let's say I'm slaughtering it, but at the time I'm slaughtering it, I have in mind that I'm going to sprinkle the blood at the wrong time. I'm not going to sprinkle it in its designated time span. I'm going to do it in 2 days. That intent to do a future avodah later on spoils the sacrifice immediately when I do the shchita. So that means that even though the Kohen, then some Kohen says, you know what, I changed my mind, I'm going to do it properly. The animal is still, we call it pigul. It's nullified just based on the intention, the bad intention that you had from the beginning. So Rabbi Yochanan says, that's first of all, you have to know that that's the fact, right? Bad intention at an early stage ruins the sacrifice all down the line, despite the fact that you don't actually do what you said you were going to do wrong, right? So that's first thing you have to know. And then v'yalfinon chutz mipnim. Then he says a second thing. The rules for Avodah Zara are the same as the rules for korbanos in the Beis Hamikdash. Just like in the Beis Hamikdash, this is what Yehuda was commenting. All these korbanos require these steps, right? Korbanos. What about Avodah Zara? Avodah Zara doesn't necessarily follow the same rules. He says that when it comes to sacrifices for idolatry are essentially imitating sacrifices in the Beis Hamikdash. So what would invalidate a sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash also eliminates it or makes it into idolatry from the beginning. So if somebody was bringing a korban and he shechts it with the idea and the intent of burning these fats for idolatry, as soon as you slaughter it, the animal becomes prohibited as idolatrous. That's what Rabbi Yochanan holds. For Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar, muteres. It's fine. It's okay. Why? Because he doesn't agree. Just because that's the way it works in the Beis Hamikdash doesn't mean that's the way it works in idolatry. Your bad intent. Normally we don't say if I intend to do an avera, I get credit for the avera before I did the avera. So here too, I didn't do the avera. I thought I was going to do it and I didn't. So therefore, why does the animal become prohibited? Okay, so therefore, so why is the cheese? So the point that we're making is why is the cheese of the place of base onaiki, which is made from the stomachs of these calves, right? They were slaughtered for avodas kochavim, but clearly something happened because the animal didn't get brought for avodah zara because we wound up having the stomachs and the containers or whatever. So therefore, they sat there slaughtering all these animals. That should be permitted, he says to Reish Lakish. Those animals shouldn't be prohibited. So he says, Amarle tarmincha sha'atcha ve'omar begmar zvicha hu ovda. So he says you should have your mazel should be elevated, right? Termich shatach. Your mazel should be elevated. It's a great question, but I've got an answer for it. He says what happens is that the intention was to serve the idol by slaughtering the animal. So therefore, as soon as they shech the animal, it's already avodah zara. That's for sure a circumstance now that the animal, and that's how they did it in that place, Basel Nike. So all of these the stomachs were all no good. You couldn't use the internal the stuff from the inside of those stomachs. Okay, so that is Rabbi Meir's view of cheese, right? Again, so to summarize where Rabbi Meir is, Rabbi Meir says that you've got animals that are used for idolatry. They were slaughtered for the sake of idolatry. And now you're going to take the contents of the stomach of an animal slaughtered for idolatry. We're going to mix that with milk and we're going to use that for cheese. That's prohibited, right? And not only is it prohibited, it's prohibited from getting any benefit. That's Rabbi Meir's point of view. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Then we said Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Shal Rabbi Yishmael. So Rabbi Yehuda, right? The next case is that Rabbi Yehuda asked Rabbi Yeshua the question, right? How did the Mishnah go? Hang on one second. Let's take a look back at the Mishnah for a second, because it's a back and forth conversation. Right, it was back on Lamed Bays. Where was it? Oops. Not finding the.
It's on Tesla days.
It's where? Chav Tesla Bays? Wow, it's far away.
Yeah, over here.
Mishnah was on Chav Tesla. Okay, there. The Gemara was. So, okay, so what happened was. Right. So that was we went to Rabbi Yehuda. He asks Rabbi Yishma. So Rabbi Yehuda, so Rabbi Yehuda said, he told the story that Rabbi Shmuel asked Rabbi Yeshua the question, right? And reading the Mishnah says, Keshahayu ma'achim ba'derech, while they were walking, Amar Li said to him, Mipnei ma'asru gvinos ovdei kochavim. What is the reason why non-Jewish cheese is prohibited in the first place? Amar Lo, Mipnei shema'amidno so bekeva shel nevela, and he answered because they used the keva, which is a stomach, right? I think the article translates a maw. And I wasn't sure. I thought a maw was a jaw. Apparently, the maw is any part of the opening of the digestive system. And I looked at Google that because I didn't understand my translation. So therefore, it goes all the way down to the stomach. They would use the stomachs of nevela. That's what he answered him. So, and then he answered him back. What are you talking about? What about we said the contents of the stomach of a korban olah isn't prohibited, right? And then he changed the subject and he says, hey, let's talk about something else. So this is a weird conversation. And now we're going to discuss this conversation. But first, Brian has a question.
No, it was more of a comment. I was just going to say that if according to the opinion that says we cannot use it because the animal is sacrificed for Avodah Zara, then and you can't have hana from it. Therefore, the whatever is inside the stomach is considered part of the animal, right?
That's what it sounds like. Yes.
Right. So then I'm assuming.
Then your meat and milk question, you're saying it comes back.
Right.
So hang on, I'm not sure that it does, but we'll have to see the whole Gemara. But yes, it's a fair observation. Fair observation. Okay, so hang on though, because we're gonna distinguish. I'm gonna give you the heads up. We're gonna distinguish between the contents being part of the animal versus what we call pirish, which is refuse of an animal, and whether that's all part of the same idea. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about this conversation. Amar Rav Achtavoy, Amar Rav. So Rav Achtavoy said the name of Rav. Hamakadesh beferish shur haniskal mikudeshes. So if somebody decides, I want to be a romantic, you know what's perfect for the wedding? I will marry my wife. I will offer her manure from an ox that is going to be killed because it murdered somebody. And nothing says I love you like a manure from an ox that murdered somebody, because that's the way to start. Yeah, you have a comment. Yes, Yehuda.
Remind me not to go to that wedding.
Okay, so you go. Right. You know that there's problem. Okay. But in any event, that's what the guy had. Okay. He went to the jewelry store. He's looking at the diamond rings. Can't afford that one. I can't afford it. What's in my price range? And the guy showed the manure section. That's, where like you're too cheap. But in any event.
So when he says Hare at Mikudeshet, he presents the.
Yes.
That's what he's got.
That's what he's got. Right. Here's my chunk of manure, which came from my animal, which is going to be killed because it killed somebody. Okay. So now she's married. It works. Now, the problem with that is that we know that if an ox kills a person, then the ox becomes prohibited from getting any benefits, right? It can't, the ox is supposed to be killed by Beis Din, and it is prohibited. You're not allowed to get any benefit from the animal at all. So now if you've got manure that comes from this animal, so how can you get any benefit from it? It must be, Brian, right, that the manure that comes from the animal is not part of the animal, right? So that's what's going on here. It's a separate thing. It's the excrement, the refuse of the animal. It's not really part of the animal. So therefore, I'm getting benefit. I'm getting married with it, right? I get dressed up. I don't know do you wear overalls to that wedding? Like, is that like, it makes, right? I think so. So, in any event, so that is, right. I guess the Kahal is his first cousin. Like this, you count there. Are there more members of the band than the Kala's teeth? You know that you've got all of these kinds of these jokes happening at this wedding. In any event, if he used beferish egle avodas kochavim, now comes in the next guy, right? He says, I want to one up this. I'm going to use the manure from an animal that was used for avodah zara. So he says, Eina mekudeshes. That does not work. Okay. Now, if Brian, we're seeing something here, right? If the manure is something separate from the animal by the animal that's going to be slaughtered, by the animal that's going to be stoned, then why is the manure part of the animal when it comes to the animal that's avodah zara? And this was sort of Brian's question about the contents of the stomach, and I think the answer applies the same way when we see the answer. Either I can tell you a logical reason why that's the case, or I can tell you why the pasuk says so. Let's take a look at the logical reason. The answer is the refuse of the animal makes the animal's stomach look bigger and more bloated. And so therefore, that's a beneficial thing. Because the bigger the animal, the more respectful it is to give as a sacrifice. So therefore, you want your animal being big and bloated. And I think that's why, Brian, I think that the contents of the stomach, it applies the same way, right? You want the contents of the stomach to be there. Therefore, it benefits and makes the animal better. And therefore, we consider the contents of the stomach and the manure that's still inside the animal to be part of the animal. And therefore prohibited for use. Aval gabi shor niskal, but the ox that's going to be stoned anyway, lo nichale benafche. What difference does it make? Right? That stuff doesn't make it. The animal's getting destroyed anyway. The size of the animal makes no difference. So therefore, in that circumstance, the animal is not, the contents of the animal's stomach is not prohibited from getting any benefit. Or else I'll show you a pasuk. Pasuk says, it says pasuk here, Lo yidbak biyadcha me'uma. Do not let any remnant of it stick to your hand, which is talking about manure. No, I guess don't. That's generally a good idea. But in any event, right, don't let any of the idolatry, you don't use any of it, right? There's no uksiv hasam. Then it says, Sakol yisakel hashor velo yochel is bisaro. You should stone the ox, and you shouldn't eat from consume from its flesh. Bisaro aser. Its flesh is prohibited. Ha pirasho muteres. The refuse from the animal is fine. It's just the meat that becomes prohibited. Amar Rava says tarvaihu taninhi. So he says that both of these we can see from our Mishnah. From the fact that he says remember how this discussion between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yehoshua went. First, he said, why can't we eat non-kosher cheese, the non-juice cheese? And he said, because we take the animals, they would slaughter their non-kosher animals, and they would take the contents of the stomach from a non-kosher animal. And he answers him back. He says, he says, yeah, but the internal contents of a stomach of an olah should be worse. And we said that a Kohen can consume that, and it would not be a problem of me'ilah, right? So therefore, the contents of an olah's stomach is not an olah. So for sure, the contents of the stomach of the nevela shouldn't be. Miklal de asure hana sharu pirshaihu. So what he was trying to prove is that despite the fact that the korban olah is prohibited from getting any benefit out of it, which is not the case by a nevela. A nevela, right, is non-kosher animal, a kosher animal that was slaughtered without shtita. You cannot eat it, but thank you, Lamed Hamid Aleph. But you can get benefit from nevela, but you can't get benefit from a korban olah. The korban olah is no benefit. So nevertheless, the contents of the stomach can still be used. So what is Rabbi Yehoshua answering back? He says, oh no, I changed my mind. It's because they use the contents of the stomach of an animal for avodah zara. I just started my whiteboard by clicking on something. Sorry, I don't know what I did. Did not intend to do that, which I will close that. Or maybe that wasn't me.
Yeah, it's Yehuda Green was whiteboard.
So Yehuda Greenwood's whiteboard. Okay, so Yehuda's kind of
I'm
closing
gonna,
over. Okay,
there we
good.
go.
Perfect. Thanks. Anyway, yeah, no, that's a good tool, but not for today. So, so he turns back and he says, "What about the stomach? What about the contents of the stomach of idolatry?" And so then he answers him back, "Im kain lama lo asura behana." That if it was the contents of the stomach for Avodah Zara that was the issue, then it wouldn't be merely that you couldn't eat the cheese of the non-Jews; it would be prohibited to get any benefit from the cheese of non-Jews. So miklal davodas kochavim also pure shayhu. So therefore, you can see that the contents of the stomach of Avodah Zara would be prohibited from getting any benefit. And there, Brian, there's our answer to Rabbi Meir's point of view, right? The contents of the stomach is prohibited, not because it's meat, by the way. It's because it helps the cow look bigger and fatter, and therefore it's part of the idolatrous service to have that in there. Okay? So why doesn't he answer him back? Mishum delese liisura be'ene. What about the fact? Take a look what's going on with the cheese. The cheese, you take the contents of the stomach, the chemicals of the digestive chemicals of the calf congeal the milk. Okay, that's what's going on. But once that gets mixed in with the milk, the contents are not visible anymore. So therefore, why shouldn't we permit the idolatrous the contents of the stomach from the idolatrous animals? Why shouldn't we permit it? Because it got mixed together with the milk and it's gone. You can't see it anymore. So the answer is dehamorius l'rabanan delo asru behana. After all, the morius. Remember we had the morius where we said the Rabbanan said if they mix wine into it, you can't eat it, but they never said it was prohibited to get benefit out of it. Well, why wasn't it prohibited to get benefit? We asked that at the beginning of our shiur, right? Why isn't it prohibited to get any benefit out of that morius when you mix wine into it? The answer is because once it's mixed in, the wine isn't visible. So therefore, once it's not visible, the Chachamim's takana, the rabbinic enactment, only said don't eat it, but doesn't have anything to do without getting any benefit from it. My time lav mishum delese liisur beine. Isn't it that because you can't see it once it's mixed in? So therefore, also the contents of the calf's stomach in the cheese is now mixed in with the cheese. You can't see it or tell that it's part of the cheese either. So Amri hacha kevan deukme kamokim choshev lekeman deise liisur beine. The answer is since this establishes it helps, it's the product that makes the milk congeal, despite the fact that you can't see it and separate it out, you know that it's there because that's what made the product congeal. This is the famous Twizzlers shaila, right? What bracha do you make on Twizzlers? Right? Do you make mizonos on Twizzlers? Do you make a shako on Twizzlers? So the issue that comes up is that you've got flour or wheat mixed in with your Twizzlers, and if you read the ingredients, but it is clearly not a main ingredient. You wouldn't be able to tell or see it in any sort of a way. However, there are many poskim who say that you say mizonos and Twizzlers based on this idea that since it makes it stick together, right? Oh, so Yehuda says it's the flour is the first ingredient. Mashgiach, it's dangerous to have mashgiach call, right? Since the flour is making the candy hold its shape, so then you can't say it's an insignificant ingredient that you can't tell it's there. Just like this cheese, you can't say it's an insignificant ingredient, and therefore the bracha should be mizonos. I personally am a mizonos Twizzlers maker, so there you make sure you know your brachos on Twizzlers to be asked. My son is asking me, we are? Yes, we are. We are mizonos Twizzlers maker. Okay, now. Now comes the interesting conversation. He changes the subject, right? He gave him an answer about Avodah Zara. He says back to him, he says, well, if it's for Avodah Zara, then why don't you agree with Rabbi Meir and say that it's prohibited for benefit? And he goes, hey, let's talk about something else. That's how the conversation in the Mishnah goes. So let's talk about what he talked about. My kidovim dodecha miyayin. So he says, what does this mean that the words of your beloved are more precious than wine? Ki asa Rav Dimi Amar, Rav Dimi came here and said, Amra Knesset Yisrael Lefnei Kodesh Baruch Hu. The Jewish people are saying to Hashem, Ribono Shel Olam, Arevim Alai Divarai Dodecha Yoser Minei Shel Torah, Miyena Shel Torah. The words of the sages who interpret the Torah are more precious to you than the words of the Torah, the wine of the Torah itself, right? Because when you give it to the sages and the sages are learning it and interpreting it and understanding it, the fact that they've taken ownership of it is much more beloved to Hashem than just the original words of the Torah themselves. My shna haikra dishayle. So he says, okay, so then why is it that when he changed the subject, that's what he chose to change the subject to? Right? It's an odd thing. He changed the subject. We're not talking about it. He goes, why did he decide to change the subject to that? Reb Shimon Pazi. Reb Shimon Pazi says, "Ve'itema Reb Shimon bar Ami me reshe dekra kamarli." He says, because you have to look at what was at the beginning of that pasuk. The beginning of the pasuk is Yashkeni minishikos pihu, that you caused me to kiss me with the kisses of my mouth. So therefore, what he's saying is that the words of the Chachamim, the enactments of the Chachamim are very precious, right? The words that come out of the Chachamim's mouth are very precious. And so therefore he was giving him a hint. The answer, it's a Takanas Chachamim. Don't press me further, right? I can't, I'm not going to explain more, but the reason I'm pushing you off with answers that you're right, are not the right answers, but I don't want to tell you what the right answer is because you got to trust the words of the Chachamim. Amar le Yishmael achi chashok sifsosecha zu bazu va'al tivahel lehashiv. He says, just keep your lips together, shut your lips, don't keep going, right? We're not going to have this. Is the conversation can't go any further. That's what he was telling him. My taima. So what's the reason? Why did he tell him that? Why didn't he just give him the answer? So Amar Ula v'itema Rav Shmuel bar Abba gezerah chadasha. The answer is that it was a brand new takana. Right? By the time that they were answering this question, this takana about not eating non-kosher cheese, or with the idea that there is such a thing as non-kosher cheese, right, was brand new. Now, something that we have to know is that kosher milk from kosher animals has some unique properties to it. One of the things that is unique about kosher milk is that it congeals and can become cheese. Non-kosher milk cannot become cheese. I've never tried it, but I believe that's what the Gemara tells us. So I believe that there's some fact to that. So therefore, right, if somebody's Googling, see if there's no pig cheese, right? There's Brian, yeah.
I was going to say, I asked Rabbi when I became Kol Yisrael, Rabbi Shiner said that because you cannot make, oh no, it was butter. Never mind. I'm going to put my hand down. You cannot make butter.
Butter's the same thing.
Right, you can't make it. You can't make it out of a non-kosher animal.
Yes, and this
That's
brings
why.
one of the first shiurim of Rabbi Frand that I had heard stuck in my head, which is why in Baltimore so many people who keep Chalav Yisrael eat at the non-Chalav Yisrael Dunkin' Donuts. And they don't, I don't know if they do it anymore, but this was some like 25, 30, this is my Baltimore now, I have to say my Torah from Baltimore that's here. And Rabbi Frand, who's very famous and from Ner Yisrael in Baltimore. And he said, because you cannot make butter or you cannot make cheese from non-kosher milk. Therefore, they went one step further and they said, powdered milk also is in that category as well. All of the Dunkin' Donuts recipes don't contain actual real milk. They contain powdered milk. And so therefore, there's no issue with powdered milk of non-Chalav Yisrael powdered milk. So what difference does that make? That means that if you are a Chalav Yisrael subscriber, then the instant hot cocoa, that's dairy, right, could theoretically be used even though you don't keep Chalav Yisrael because that's all powdered milk, right? Everything in there is instant. However, many people are more machmir, and Yehuda is going to tell me that the Chabad also, right? Powdered milk is not going to be acceptable for what do you call it? For most people who are not Chalav Yisrael, they'll still look for Chalav Yisrael cheese, Chalav Yisrael milk, Chalav Yisrael everything, because that is not the accepted Chalav Yisrael practice, which is a chumrah in the first place, which we'll discuss. Yehuda, yeah.
How do you make powdered milk with regular milk and make it not Chalav Yisrael?
You take you take regular milk and you remove the water. Right. So I don't know exactly how you do it, right? There's a machine that dehydrates, right? That dehydrates the milk, removes the water, and leaves the essence and the powder of it. Sure, there's much more complicated than that. But
would it still be considered as milk? Whether
So yes, it would still be milk, but the point is it would not be able to be turned into powdered milk well through the process if it was non-kosher milk in the first place. So therefore, all cheese shouldn't need a hechsher. I'm sure that that's where the conservative Jews get the idea that you can eat out milchik, right? Because you don't have to worry about non-kosher cheese, right? There should not be any such. There should be no such thing as non-kosher cheese, which Tosfos and Rashi are going to discuss why that is in fact not true. But we will discuss that is not true from our Gemara. But we're taking our time through this Gemara to be able to make sure we get all the parts to it. But when we get there, we'll see that. In any event, though, right? The point of the conversation was they were having this back and forth, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Yeshua, and they got to a point where Rabbi Yeshua just says, "Okay, enough questions. This is a new gezerah. We're not eating the cheese from non-Jews. Don't ask why. Don't. It's new gezerah." We don't start up. Once there's a new gezerah, when the Chachamim establish a new gezerah, we don't discuss it. We just say, hey, it's a gezerah. That's the That's the process. Once the Chachamim say, this is a gezerah, we don't discuss why. So my gezerta, so what was the gezerah? Ben Amar Shimon Pazi, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Mishum Nikur. So he says that the reason why is because they would leave their utensils open, right? They saw that the non-Jews are leaving their milk uncovered, and the problem with them leaving they're concerned about the venom from the snakes getting in there, and so therefore it's dangerous. So therefore they told them, they said we were not going to eat we're not kosher cheese anymore. Okay. So why didn't he just tell him? Why was he so like, tell him, don't ask me any more questions. We don't talk about it. Just tell him, because the snake venom. Remember, we know about snake venom. We're not going to eat from it. So the answer is Ula. It's like Ula says, Da'amar Ula, as Ula said, Ki gazri gezerto b'marava, lo megalu taima adresa yarchi shasa. When they make a gezerah in Eretz Yisrael, they don't tell you the reason for 12 months. They don't explain it. Dilma ika inish de lo sphirale. Why? Because there's always going to be some guy who's going to say, I don't agree with that, right? And therefore he's going to come and make fun of the takana. So therefore, we don't tell anybody what the reason for the takana is until it's established. Once everybody's doing it, then we can say, okay, it was because of this. But for the first 12 months, because we're going to see later on that if a takana gets established, if an enactment gets established, and the Jewish people, the community, does not take it on, then it doesn't become rule. It doesn't become law. The process of creating a stringency and enactment of Beis Din requires that Beis Din set it up, and then the congregation does it. If it's impossible, they try it and it doesn't work, then it never becomes law. So therefore, they wanted to avoid, because then somebody would just get up and go, snake venom. Nobody worries about snake venom anymore. So they said, don't tell me that you're the non-Jew who lives 2 doors down from you covers his barrel, and therefore we're not worried about snake venom, right? We are all worried about it, and so therefore we're establishing that rule. So he didn't explain it. Okay. So Megadev ba Rabbi Yirmiyah. So Rabbi Yirmiyah did not like that answer. He said, Elameata, so if that's the case, Yevesha tishtari, Yoshan tishtari. Well, if it's because of snake venom, then you should just take a look at the cheese. If the cheese works, right, we know that snake venom prevents wine from aging. It prevents the alcohol from fermenting. The snake venom is going to stop the cheese from congealing, and it's going to stop it from aging properly. If the cheese spoils and goes bad, then okay, there could have been snake venom. But if the cheese is good cheese after 12 months, you're going to store your cheese for a while anyway. Let it sit in the warehouse for 12 months. Once the cheese sits and it's not ruined after 12 months, you know that it's kosher cheese. And you know that there's no snake venom, so you should be okay. Damar Rabbi Chanina, as Rabbi Chanina says, Yavesh mutter, that if you have dried out, good, aged cheese, so then it's permissible, right? The venom is not an issue anymore. Ein manicho liyavesh. So you're right. So he says, you're right. If they left it to dry, also yashon, and also if it was old mutter, then you're right. Then the cheese would be fine. Ein manicho liyashon. So this issue, this takana was that they didn't, right? Then we would have to worry about it. So they said, we're not going to allow you to eat any non-Jews cheese because you might eat cheese that's newer and there might be snake venom in it. So therefore, we're not going to do it. Okay. Now, it's good to just freeze this moment in time for a moment because we're going to have a whole bunch of other potential explanations for what the issue with cheese is. But Tosfos is going to end up and say, this is the reason, right? All of the other reasons that get brought up, we knock them off. This answer stands. Therefore, Tosfos says that since nowadays in modern times, we don't have the snake venom issue, right? The water, if we leave things overnight, we don't worry about snake venom. It's not an issue for us anymore. Therefore, since snake venom is not an issue, non-Jews cheese should be kosher. So that's Tosfos' answer. Tosfos holds, and it's not like most other poskim, most other Rishonim, but Tosfos actually comes to the conclusion that there's non-Jews cheese doesn't require hechsher, right? It's kosher, it's fine, and you're in good shape. So that's why I point that out here, because we're going to move on from this answer, and Rashi's going to say that the answer is other things, potential other problems, and they are going to be real. So, Amar Rabbi Chanina says the reason why you're not allowed to eat non-kosher cheese, or non-kosher, the reason non-Jews cheese is not kosher is because the answer is we're worried that there's no way that there won't be some little bits of milk inside the cheese. Now, Rashi interprets this as a new answer. He says, you know what the issue is? The non-Jew is going to take kosher milk and he's going to put some non-kosher milk in it as well because it's cheaper and it fills it up, right? And now I'm going to make cheese out of it. Now, we said only the kosher milk is going to congeal. So therefore, based on the fact that I've got a piece of cheese here, the cheese is kosher, right? Whatever's the non-kosher milk wouldn't have congealed, it would have dripped away. Not true. What he's saying is that there are holes and there's gaps in the cheese. And the non-kosher milk gets trapped into those little areas of the cheese. And so therefore, you are eating your kosher cheese mixed with little bits of non-kosher milk built into it. That's why you can't eat a non-Jews cheese. That's how Rashi learns. And therefore, we don't eat a cheese from a non-Jew, right? Without a hechsher, without certifying that the milk didn't come from any other sources. Brian, yes.
I was gonna say I learned also that they used to mix pig milk with cow milk because it would age. It wouldn't go bad as quickly. It would slow down the aging. Yeah,
it's a good point because Tosfos doesn't like Rashi because it makes no sense. If you're a cheese salesman and you know you've got a product that doesn't congeal into cheese, why would you mix that into your milk that does congeal into cheese? So the answer that Brian's giving is because it might help keep your milk stay longer, right? It's a good answer. I don't know if it's true, but Brian has a good source, right? It's good. So therefore, Brian's source is good. There's a thumbs up on the source. So therefore, that makes some sense. It could defend Rashi's answer. Tosfos says that this is a continuation of the previous answer. What Tosfos is saying is, you know what the issue is? You're right. Even if you had your point was that if you had old cheese, you should be allowed to eat the old cheese because it would have congealed, to which he says, no, because if you had snake venom in it, even old cheese would still have some of the non-congealed milk stuck in it where the snake venom would be. And therefore, the cheese is no good because of the snake venom, not because of non-kosher milk. Because even if it was kosher milk, if it had snake venom in it, it would still not congeal, but it wouldn't disappear. It would get stuck in the cheese. Okay, so that's where we have a Rashi and our Tosfos disagree as to the reason, the rationale behind why we cannot eat non-Jews cheese, and therefore why we hold like Rashi and the rest of the poskim agree that you have to worry about other ingredients that are not kosher getting mixed in with your cheese, and therefore you need a hechsher on your cheese to be able to ensure that it is kosher. Whereas Tosfos says, no, they were never worried about that. They were always only worried about snake venom, and we don't worry about snake venom anymore. Therefore, we can eat the cheese. Okay. Ushmuel Amar mibnei shema'amidin osa be'or kevas nevela. Shmuel says, I'll give you a whole different reason why. The problem was that they wouldn't use the contents of the stomach. They would actually take the stomach and put the milk into the stomach in order to help it make the cheese. This is Brian's problem. Now you've got an eat milk problem, right? You're taking a fleischic stomach and you're using it to congeal the cheese. That is a problem. Now, by the way, they don't mention the Rishonim don't say it's because of mixing meat and milk. They say it's because you have a non-kosher stomach, right? It came from a non-shechted animal, right? It's non-Jews, right? So it's a non-shechted animal. So you're taking the prohibited flavoring from the non-shechted animal, getting that non-kosher taste into the cheese, or getting that non-kosher product into the cheese. That's your problem. Why don't they talk about it being a meat and milk prohibition? It's a big conversation amongst the Rishonim to discuss why it is, but this would be Brian's issue, right? Bringing in a product from the stomach, if they use the actual stomach. But one second, hakeva gufa sharia. So he says don't we believe that the stomach itself should be permitted to eat, right? Omi amar Shmuel hachi. Does Shmuel really say that? That's not. We learned in the Mishnah. Kevas ha'ove kochavim v'shel nevela harezu asura. If you have the stomach from an animal, from Avodah Zara, and also from a nevela, so then it's prohibited from getting any. It's prohibited. You can't eat it. So we ask the following question: Atu dove kochavim lav nevela. If it's a non-Jew who's making who's slaughtering the animal, of course it's nevela. That's the definition of nevela. So therefore, what we mean is, Vamar Shmuel, Chada Ketani, Shmuel said it's one statement, right? Kevas shchitas avodas kochavim, that ove kochavim. If you have the stomach, which was of an animal that was shechted by a non-Jew, nevela, it becomes nevela, right? It becomes nevela, and asura, and it's prohibited from eating it. Okay, so how did you say that you're allowed? You're allowed to use it. Now you said you're not allowed to use it. So the answer is lo kash. It's not a contradiction. Kan kodim chazara, kan leachar chazara. The answer is that this Mishnah, this was stated before Rabbi Yeshua changed his mind. Right? He told before he told Rabbi Shmuel that the reason. At first, he said the reason why the cheese was a problem is because they used the stomachs of nevela. Right? That showed that it was prohibited. You can't use it. And then we said, no, that's not what the problem was at all. The problem was snake venom. And now that he changed his mind, the problem was really the snake venom, it means that using the stomachs from a nevela is in fact not a problem. He changed his mind and decided that it was permissible. So therefore, Mishnah lo zoza mimkoma. They just never changed the Mishnah in Chulin where it indicates that it's prohibited, despite the fact that in the end, it is permissible. So therefore, that's not a good answer. We wanted to say it was because they used the stomach of the animal. It's not a good answer because in the end of the day, that is not prohibited. And Rav Malchia, we'll just end with this. Rav Malchia says Mishmei de Rav Ada Barava. He says the name of Rav Ada Barava. Amar mipnei shemachlikin paneha b'shumen chazir. You know what the problem with cheese of non-Jews is? Cheese non-Jews, they take pig fat and they put it on the outside of it to preserve it. Maybe that's what you're thinking of, Brian, with the pigs, whatever, right? They take the pig fat and they put it on the outside of the cheese to keep the cheese preserved. And obviously rubbing pig fat on the outside of your cheese is going to make it non-kosher. Okay? And Rav Chisda says, the reason why is because they didn't use rennet in order to make their cheese congeal. They used vinegar. And vinegar, we know, is a product that started off as wine, and then it could be yayin nesach, and the vinegar is no good. So, and Rab Nachman says, Bar Yitzchak Amar Nosa Bisraf HaUrla. He says they used to use the sap from an urla tree, and urla is prohibited from getting any hana'ah from. So let's stop here because we're going to get into urla for the next several paragraphs. But this was a list, and we'll pick up from this last item on this list of the sap from orla, of that they cannot use it as a congealing agent for their cheese.
Beautiful Shkoya. Thank you.
Today is Lamed. The official daf of today is Lamed A.
I think it's Lamed Daled.
Give me one second. I'll let you know. Stay on the line with me. Give me one second here.
All right.
Open my WhatsApp. One